Good morning, esteemed ladies and gentlemen. I am happy to greet my dear colleagues here. My name is Oksana Kulakovska. I am the director of the Analytical Center of the Ukrainian Catholic University. And today we gathered here in order to present developments of the project group that conducted an audit of Ukrainian legislation that is dedicated to the occupied territories from 2014 to 2020. Why this idea was born in the Analytical Center of Ukrainian Catholic University? For us, it is very important subject of the social security, and the challenges that are caused by occupation is in the focus of studies and analytical work of our center. And this is why university in general is an active subject in the social processes of our country, the subject of occupation and of its consequences and solutions that had to become the basis of the future public policies directed to the occupied territories, stays as an important subject for the work of the Analytical Center, as well as for the wider circle of partners that are engaged, including representatives of the civil society and representatives of the public administration and educational institutions in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine. The idea of conducting that audit was born at the very beginning, when we understood that the search of the common solutions and of the joint vision is not possible without understanding the final state of affairs. Until we don't understand what kind of challenges we are facing now and we will have in the future, when the occupied territories will return to Ukraine. So the first idea was born to conduct the audit of the legislative basis in order to understand whether we have enough of the legal instruments in order to regulate the issues caused by occupation. And when the set of normative and legal acts were started from 2014 to 2020, this work was conducted with the support of the Renaissance Foundation and Sweden Embassy in Ukraine, with the collaboration of the representation of the President in the Crimea Autonomous Republic. We understood that the set of that legal instruments does not give us complete picture, does not give us understanding whether we have possibilities and abilities to apply that legal instruments in order to resolve the problems, and whether we have enough of that instruments. Because we can say that the arsenal of the legal instruments is sufficient in order to resolve all the problems caused by occupation. This is why the idea was born to conduct wider context analytical work in order to study under what conditions these legal instruments are applied, how do they work, what practices were worked out during the recent years, what practices are positive, and maybe some other practices are not that efficiently applied, can be applied in the future. And this is why this project was continued with participation as wide circle of experts from different spheres. We conducted 8 expert roundtables dedicated to 8 subjects, and on the results of that expert discussions, we prepared analytical part of the report that presents the general context, that shows why the problems appear that are regulated by the legal basis, that studies the changes that take place in the legislation of Ukraine and the recent practices, and also presents the package of recommendations. This work was carried out in collaboration and with support of the National Fund for Support of Democracy, and with the support of the Department of Media, Education and Culture of the U.S. Embassy. And of course, this work could not be that well based if it would not be conducted within such a project team that is my great pleasure to present right now with deep gratitude. So this is Ostap Krivdik, associated this researcher of the Analytical Research Center, Stanislav Fedorchuk, the head of the NGO that is called Ukrainian People's Council of Donetsk and Lugansk areas, and Alim Aliyev, Deputy General Director of Ukrainian Institute. So Alim and Stanislav represented in this project team the communities of the occupied territories, correspondingly of Donetsk, Lugansk regions, and of Autonomous Republic of Crimea. And now I understand that we are going to continue in the following way. I would like to ask Ostap to present a deeper understanding of the work that has been conducted and the result achieved, and then I'd like to ask the colleagues to share their insights, impressions, and understanding. What can be found in that report in the subject matter areas, and what will require further development. Please, Ostap, the floor is yours. Thank you, Oksana. I would like to separately add the words of gratitude to the analytician of this project, Bogdan Banyuk, who working in a very systemic and hard way and participated in this work, conducted a lot of analytical work and organizational work. Thank you very much, Bogdan. Talking about the project itself, objectively, as it seems to me, this was a very important work for our understanding of the unified Ukraine, because every part of Ukraine is inseparable, and independently whether this is Lviv region or Crimea region, this is all Ukraine, and we have to treat all our territories independently, whether they are occupied or not, in the same serious attitude. And even more to our wounded lands, we have to be still more attentive. I would like to present shortly right now our main data about our project and to dwell upon its conclusions. So our study covered 177 normative and legal acts that were approved in Ukraine from 2014 to 2020, as well as 32 resolutions of international organizations that applied to corresponding subjects that were adopted by the UN General Assembly and by the European Parliament or in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Looking at what normative and legal acts were adopted in Ukraine and that we've started, that were 82 laws of Ukraine, 28 resolutions of the Parliament, 28 resolutions of the Cabinet of Ministers, 70 orders, and 11 decisions of the Cabinet of Ministers and of the Parliament. More than 100 experts participated in our discussions, and they participated in 8 meetings that were dedicated to the following subjects: on international law and security, on economic and social policy, on education and identity, freedom of confession, and information policy. Talking about the structure of our report, in the beginning we have introduction, then 7 parts of the main chapters. So we, out of 8 roundtables, we created 7 parts. But in every part, we highlighted the problem. We were showing how the legal field was changing. We described the practices that quite often do not coincide with what is foreseen by the law. And we also presented recommendations and legal audit that can be useful for those who directly work with the Ukrainian legislation. So our 3 main conclusions are as follows. Conclusion number 1. We conducted the active work was conducted by the legislative branch of power that developed special legislation directed to fight against aggression. Secondly, there are positive practices that help Ukraine to stand for its interests under the conditions of aggression that also can be used by other countries that suffer from similar problems. And the third conclusion is that legislative activities dedicated to the temporarily occupied territories is not overwhelming. There is some gap between legislation and the practices of its application. Several sub-problems. First of all, and this is a legislative problem, is the absence of the holistic terminological field. Like, different terms are used to describe the same phenomena that give very different shades. And great role is played here by Minsk agreements that, in fact, influence legal rhetorics concerning the war and occupation and aggressor. So, giving specific examples of such terminological gaps, for example, they write about conflict or international military conflict. Or, for example, this is the borderline or the conflict line. And so what is necessary is to get some political consensus about the values on which the occupation will take place and reintegration, and the holistic vision how this reintegration should take place. What should be the future of the temporarily occupied territories inside composition of Ukraine? And I thank you. And now I pass the floor to Alim Aliyev, Deputy General Director of Ukrainian Institute. We shared with our colleagues the subjects, and Alim will now take the floor. Thank you, Ostap. Thank you, dear colleagues. I am glad to see here familiar faces that also participated now in our expert discussions. And I would like to say that this work lasted for quite a long period of time. It was conducted from different sides, and it is very important because legislation, as my colleague has mentioned, was not well agreed upon, but the analysis of the legal field, of the legal basis of Ukraine, is one of the fundamental steps forward that helps to be more systemic, to be better based in decision making. During our discussions that were conducted according to Chatham House rules, and we had quite hot debate sometimes that maybe have their right for existence, because experts looking through different prisms at assessment of different events, and this is why in the report we represent quite different standpoints that were expressed. And this is kind of a synthesis of recommendations, of thoughts, of conclusions that were presented during that round tables. I would like to make certain conclusions concerning the policies and general recommendations. Talking about economy on the occupied territories, one of the recommendations was to change legislation on a free economic zone of Crimea, and also crossing the administrative border with Crimea. And experts were highlighting the fact that, taking into account the effect of the summit of Crimea platform and activization of Crimea track of the Ukrainian international policy, should be the steps taken by Ukraine in order to change legislative norms in economic relations with Crimea. And the key issue that requires a solution is to change this discrimination status of Crimea, that is the status of non-residents of Ukraine, and also limitations for estate. And these changes should be taken into the customs code of Ukraine, as well as to widen the list of the set of property and in their monetary representation that are allowed to be taken from the territory of Crimea to the territory of Ukraine, and to check also the list of the prohibited products. Another conclusion that applies to the work and to the improvement of work of that control point on the borderline with Crimea is to form high-quality infrastructure, both for fulfilling mirror function as well as to create comfort conditions to travel from the occupied territories by Ukrainian citizens. So the centers of administrative service can be created next to that control point, and this work is conducted quite actively then, but the same applies to the control points that act next to the occupied territories in Donetsk and Lugansk region. What we also underline in the economic policies is that this is necessary to have another element of economic growth and favorable conditions for infrastructural changes on the territories that were not occupied but that are on the borderline with the occupied territories. Quite often, these are the territories that are primarily the markers of changes that take place directly in Ukraine for the people that live on the temporary occupied territories. And this is what I've been mentioning, economic development of front territories, as well as we talk about separate regions of Donetsk and Lugansk region. And we said that this is necessary to specify and to formulate better regional and economic strategies. And there is also a need to improve sectorial strategies of development of the separate areas or sectors of economy, such sectors as coal mining sector, for example, industry sector, taking into account the context of development of borderline regions, front regions. And then the next block of conclusions and recommendations that apply to the policy of identity and cultural policies. One of the recommendations is to adopt the law concerning the status of the native peoples and Crimea Tatar people status. I am very happy that 1 month ago, President sent to the Parliament the draft law of the to the Parliament and about the status of the native peoples. And next week we hope that this draft law will be studied by the Parliament, approved by the Parliament, and then the separate law should be adopted on the status of Crimea Tatar people that would give opportunity for self-definition of these people within the sovereign Ukraine. And adoption of such a law is the precondition for potential development of Crimea from territorial autonomy into the national territorial autonomy, where Crimea Tatar people will be able to defend their rights and to be defended in their rights, to defend their identity. The next conclusion is to adopt state program on development of Crimea Tatar language, and the Ministry of Reintegration on the issues of temporarily occupied territories is already working on that strategy. And according to the data of UNESCO, Crimea Tatar language is included into the list of languages that is under the danger of disappearance, and it has to be defended. This is one of the languages of the native people of Ukraine, and this is one of the elements of preservation of identity. And we agreed upon the fact that, and also about IDPs that came from the occupied Crimea, they should have opportunity to study their native language, and they should also have and this opportunity should also exist for Ukrainians and for other peoples that live in Ukraine and abroad, because this can become, in fact, an online training, and in the times of pandemics it showed to be very efficient. One of another very important conclusions is to guarantee the policy of reintegration of the youth from the occupied territories. And here experts underline that Ukraine conducts the open door policy, giving opportunity for the children from the occupied territories to have access to Ukrainian educational institutions, about importance of the integration of youth, not exclusively within the framework of the educational processes, but also that the strategic document should be developed in these spheres. And here we talk about children and youth camps, educational projects, and also integration projects, because we have to understand that in some years this is going to be the youth that will take in the future decisions and will deal with decision-making on the occupied territories. And another conclusion that we have to talk here about importance of changing of legislative expertise norm, taking into account of temporarily occupied territories, for example, corruption expertise. But it is also very important to conduct similar expertise of the draft laws and how they influence deoccupation and reintegration of the temporarily occupied territories. And separate decisions that are taken at the general national level can have essential consequences within the context of the occupied territories. And the last block, just 2 or more minutes, it applies to information policy. And here one of the recommendations is to create separate order in order to receive grants for the projects that apply to the temporarily occupied territories. And you know that the state grants, it's very hard and nearly not realistic to receive for the people with a pro-Ukrainian position that want to develop legal, educational, and other kind of policies on the occupied territories, but unfortunately they don't have that opportunities. And also to adopt and implement the strategies of information reintegration of the separate regions of Donetsk and Lugansk region and Crimea. And one of the last conclusions is to take into account in the norms of the transition legislation the status of journalists and media workers under the conditions of occupation, and to monitor in the future violation of rights of journalists, and to simplify possibility of the international media journalists to be able to enter Crimea. Thank you very much for attention. Now the floor is given to Stanislav Fedorchuk. Esteemed friends, colleagues, I would like to say that today's press conference is a big event because huge number of people that we know, experts from different areas, believed us, believed that the team of the project of the Analytical Center of Ukrainian Catholic University wants not just to conduct some other audit or another project dedicated to IDPs and occupied territories of Crimea and Donbass, but try to create some synthetic product during development of which we can talk openly, sincerely. And I would like to underline methodology of the project. Chatham House gave us opportunity to hear nice things and unpleasant things from the experts of different level. And we can talk relatively objectively about the fact that quite a big number of issues that have to be generally approved, adopted, and discussed stay under the responsibility of separate agencies of experts. And this is not only the audit of legislation. This is an attempt to talk about complicated problems that are quite often stay under political opinions. And one of very important conclusions that we made as a team, and not as separate experts, if we talk about values and the world of values, talking about the legislative activities, then we lose this sense. Because there is a document, there is a formal preamble, discussion, and final decisions. But if we put the question about the values that this document represents from the standpoint of securities, dignity, human dignity, social protection, etc., then the questions are coming. Whether these documents really resolve certain issues for the future, or this is some fire emergency plan just for today and we don't think about tomorrow. I would like to start from security questions, because whatever we discuss under the context of occupied territories or liberated territories, under general Ukrainian concept, without security, we will not have education or social or economic issues. And I'm very happy that our first recommendation is to form the new mechanism of sanction policy is partially implemented. And this shows that some part of our experts were talking not only to us, but they've been also talking at the level of the parliament, at the presidential office. And we see that sanction legislation is changed. I would not say that this is an ideal legislation, but finally, we can talk about the fact that the sanctions, they will exist. But there is another important point that we highlight that is not resolved. It's the Rome Statute. We postpone it from year to year, and it shows that our political players do not understand to the end how important it is. And talking about the positive things in our conclusions, we recommended to the Parliament to put that articles about military offenses into the criminal code of Ukraine. And I would say this is great. 1 month ago it was adopted, and that was the result of the work of the analytical centers and of the NGOs that in the essence were trying to harmonize Ukrainian legislation with the world or international legislation on the military offenses. And I'm very happy that we really managed to get to that platform where these ideas were discussed and well perceived. And I hope that small percentage of our work is also an input into the legislation that finally appeared. This is very important from our standpoint to change approach to the work for the future, for the long-term period. We really suffer from the decisions of the Minsk process, and there are different reasons for that. My colleague Ostap said that because of the Minsk process, Ukrainian legislation was already deformed, because there are many terms that are quasi-legal terms, and they also are included into the Ukrainian laws, into the Ukrainian normative documents, and the highest politicians of the country are using that terms as well. And this causes correspondingly huge problems. And the work of the three-lateral contact group should be changed, because they do not show any consolidated position. because there are representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at every meeting of every subgroup, but nobody works with the members of the subgroups. There are general positions, but it goes about our general security, and correspondingly this should not be just one representative from the side of Ukraine on the trilateral group, but also during negotiations there should be agreed positions, and there can be no competition there, no any competition between the participants. This is not a legislative body where you can have a separate position or ideas. Talking about the issues of security, we should talk about maritime security, and we highlight that and all our defense and security block of questions included the attempt to resolve the borderline in Azov Sea, and agreement about the joint Azov Sea should be acknowledged as not approved. It creates lots of problems, security problems, and waiting for Russians coming to the shores of Azov Sea, we would not want to wait for that in order to start fighting. And another and the most important issue is the strategy of the maritime security of Ukraine. We should show realistically in what way we are defending ourselves and how do we return our maritime resources and territories. And under this area, this is very important to create the mapping of all territorial waters of Ukraine, not only of the Azov Sea, but also of the Black Sea. And here there are many different mechanisms that Ukraine can use, for example, by conducting joint courts with Bulgaria or Romania. This is also very important to create the center of documentation of facts of Russian aggression on Ukrainian territory. Why do we include this into the issues of security? Because we believe that without constant renewal of the databases at the state level, that would be very hard to participate not only in the international laws or lawsuits, but also to explain to the society what was really happening before and what is happening right now. Also, thanks to the activities, including of some hostile media and Russian propaganda, we are regularly offered different versions of our past that we witnessed. And there are versions, for example, there were about certain referendums or some meetings. Like in Ukraine, there exists a certain form of civil counteraction, but not a planned military psychological operations. So such a center of registration of these events should serve as the documentation center, to have videos and pictures, to give materials for international courts, for Ukrainian courts. And this is very important from my standpoint. And I hope for the opinion of all our experts to create the joint database in Ukraine. This is point number one. Here we talk about security service of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine and police of special services that pass to Russian Federation side. If in Crimea we have such a list that exists in free access, in Donetsk and Lugansk region we don't have such a list. Moreover, I want to share with you my personal opinion. Just several weeks ago, I found out that the head of Donetsk direction of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the person who was watching like Ukrainians were killed by Russian military, I think that this person cannot take any position in the Ministry of Home Affairs. He still works in the Ministry of Home Affairs in Ukraine, and now he is heading the direction in Donetsk region, and he moved from one position to another during several months. I believe this is a challenge for myself and for many others who remembers what Donetsk militia did towards Ukrainians in Donetsk region, and I hope very much that we will find ourselves strong enough to name things correctly, and this will not repeat in the future. We should remember that we don't have any methodology to calculate losses concerning the objects that are on the occupied territories. Now there are draft laws that partially talk about the fact that in the future, during the occupation, military civil administrations will conduct some audits in some ways. But from my standpoint, and for the standpoint of our experts, it would be too late to do it. We have to start audit of the lost property and objects right now and here, and do it not only on the territory of Donetsk and Lugansk, but also on the territory of Crimea as well, because unfortunately the mechanism of international courts is long-lasting, and we cannot allow to postpone for the long future to assess the losses, because we all understand very well that we will not be able to renew by Ukrainian efforts even the critically important infrastructure, without talking about industry or civil infrastructure objects and others. Unfortunately, our time is coming to the end, and I hope that we will be able to answer your questions during our discussions that I hope will take place after the final word will be made by Oksana. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stanislav, Ostap, and I would like to say, to add some more points for understanding of the work that was conducted, and maybe also dedicated to the plans for the future, and then we will be happy to answer all the questions that esteemed audience may have. I would like to return to conclusions. And here you should really highlight the following. We are in the process of conducting discussions and analytical work, but we decided to change the format. In the very first day of expert discussions, we understood that if we will have open discussions as it is normally conducted at the open platforms, we will get the same results, as you can see, in quite a large number of media platforms. But we wanted to dig deeper. We really closed discussions. And and this great spectrum of issues, of questions, of atrocities, of humanitarian and social atrocities, economic catastrophes, were highlighted during our discussions, and it shows that this report cannot be viewed as complete, and we are just standing in the beginning of the way of understanding what we really have to overcome in the nearest decades. This is number one. Number two, huge complicity in development of governmental decisions is linked with the fact that we don't have anything to implement them. We've been saying that quite a large number of normative and legal acts were adopted, so we really were answering quite efficiently to the current challenges that we've been facing, but that were reactive answers. And that was just to do away with the fire. But to take proactive steps, forming policies that will give opportunities to foresee several steps ahead, some possibilities to resolve the current problems and the future problems, it is very complicated because we don't have a joint vision, joint frameworks. and the joint strategy as a consequence. What kind of country are we building? How can we adopt separate economic policies directed to the occupied territories if we don't understand what economy are we building in general? How can we resolve the spectrum of social issues that cannot be included into the general social policy of the state, etc.? So all discussions brought us to the following. If we stay in the subject matter areas as it is done right now, then in the future we will continue to generate reactive decisions and policies. And an important challenge for the future for us, being the analytical center, is to try to have wider discourse, to conduct open discussions about the problems that we are facing, naming them openly and honestly, articulating them honestly, because as soon as we articulate them, we had several very unpleasant moments for the people that allowed themselves to mention within the process of the closed discussions, to open some open issues, honest issues. And then maybe this can be named a trauma that we are still suffering from, does not give us opportunity to look openly at the state of affairs and what we are planning to return from the standpoint of humanitarian challenges and social capital. It requires once more to have deep and high-quality discussion with the participation of the maximum number of parties. And that, as a result, can bring us all with the common efforts to develop some basic approaches in formation of the vision of our future state. And this is what our analytical center is planning to do in two directions. Number one is public discussions with putting on agenda of the most complicated issues. And number two, maybe I announce our plans, but we have to be careful about it. We still have to develop practical instruments to be included into the process of approval of the public policies of the value-oriented approach. This is what is going to give us opportunity to generate and to form efficient long-term strategic decisions on the end, public policies that are going to be based on that. So I think this is everything I wanted to mention, with the exception of one thing. I wanted to remind you, you have it on the first page, that was a very complicated work. We do not pretend to absolute conclusions, but this is a good document to start this discussion once more, to understand a large circle of issues and questions, to see possible directions of answers for that questions. And this is the work of the large team, of the project team. I want to thank our colleagues again, Alex Astap and others. And I want you to thank once more. And I thank for organizational work that was conducted by Bogdan, and others participated in this process as well. Our colleagues, Christina Dumic, Irina Luyuk, that conducted the audit itself of the legislative basis that is described in every chapter. And I want to tell you that we wanted to make this report to be a very practical instrument. When you open it, you see the context, you see, for example, introduction, very specific changes in the normative and legal basis in the sphere. You see the practices of application of that legal instruments. Then you see the first recommendations, how to answer the challenges, and the set of normative and legal acts that you can use when you resolve the problems in the specific sphere. So you can open every chapter and use it as a good working instrument. And there is no doubt that this would not be possible to be conducted without support of our partners. This is the National Fund for the Support of Democracy, as well as the Department of Mass Media, Education and Culture of the American Embassy that understood how important this work is. And I have to thank separately our donors for understanding of the fact, because we know quite often that the donors, they stimulate some public activities as well, as a rule. But I thank for the understanding that they met our needs and they allowed to conduct this work in the closed format to receive the best high-quality result. That is it that I wanted to say right now, and we will be happy now to answer your questions if you have some questions, because our time is coming to its end. But this is for sure not our last meeting. This is only our first introductory discussion. But if you have questions, we will be happy to react. Please. Please, Andrei. No microphone. Interpreter does not hear the question. Maybe someone can repeat it before answering. Because we have also translation of this presentation. So thank you for inviting. I'm very pleased to be here. You shared with us lots of very valuable ideas, but I will try to speak about sectorial segment that you've been criticizing, but maybe this is a basic segment. Talking about global things, maybe you should be based on the specific segments where you see all that issues. So us being the representatives of the Department on Confessions and freedom of confessions, what is your position? Why Ukraine is not able to create certain additional law to the legislative field that will give possibility to the presence on the occupied territories, and it applies to Crimea and to occupied territories of Donbass, of the confessions. Mr. Aliyev was talking about the law on the authentic peoples of Ukraine, because its basis was developed in 2017, and I don't know why the parliament during 4 years was not able to implement that into some law. But this is the law that was so awaiting for, and very clear that now becomes at this stage of using as a main instrument to be used against Russian propaganda. How do you think this law can provoke and can influence that context, including international context, because there are certain warnings from the Western experts concerning certain gradation of the ethnic groups that really exist within the context of that law. And third very short question, many times starting from 2015, in different forms, we had addresses to law enforcement structures of Ukraine that there are documented facts of violation of Ukrainian legislation from the side of Ukrainian citizens that stay at the territories that are not controlled by Ukrainian government. So what is missing in the legal field to apply certain sanctions to Ukrainians that are collaborants? Thank you, Andrei, for such a long list of questions that are quite complicated. If you allow a while, Aliyev and Stanislav are thinking, I agree completely with the fact that analysis and digging out the facts and building the basis on which the future decisions should be taken, it starts from sectorial level, where you have to collect facts, analyze situation in the specific sphere, and then to build your future solutions. Because future solutions, they require joint vision, but analysis should be conducted at the level of every specific subject. I hope my colleagues will answer other questions. Talking about the law about the native peoples, and Russia historically reacted quite vividly on that law, and it shows that this really deserves attention. And the second thing, yes, I have very big question mark as well, where such a law was not adopted, not even starting from 2017, but for certain decades it was not adopted. Because this law formulates the status of the native people like Karaims and Krimchaks and Crimea Tatars. These are peoples that were formed, that live on the territory of the contemporary Ukraine and have no other motherland. And evidently, if you talk about experts, this is a framework law, as it was discussed together with the colleagues and experts that worked under that law. And in the future, it just creates the framework. But in the future, I hope very much that this frameworks, it will be filled with sensible projects and processes that will give very clear understanding of the fact that the native peoples that require protection, as well as representatives of the minorities, national minorities that also require defense, they will receive they will receive that protection. I would like to say some words about legislation about collaborationism. When in 2017 we offered the text of the law, Vitaly Goncharenko and me, we offered the draft law on protection of Ukraine from collaborationism. I think that there was a very big opposition against it. And we've been based on the experience, previous experience of European collaborationism. Igor Kozlovsky, Pani Elena Stashkina, they were telling us about historical context of collaborationism, about the spiritual aspects of collaborationism. Because this is not just a process of certain mechanical betrayal. This is the process that can be described using different categories. And when we demanded certain certainty for people of the occupied territories, they had to understand what are the levels of collaboration and in what way Ukrainian state in the future will react on the fact where you've been a civil servant or military collaborationist, or you've been working in the prosecutor's office, or you were a small entrepreneur. There are different levels of collaborationism, and equal level of political and criminal responsibility cannot apply to all of them. And while we've been fighting against criticism that was persuading us that this is not good, that such a law should not exist, we finally got the results of the social surveys. There is complete consensus in Ukraine about collaborationism, that this is bad, that it should be punished, and that Ukraine should have such a legislation. Looking at today, we have 4 draft laws. One was not approved, but 3 more are presented to the Secretariat of the Parliament. Two of them were written by pro-presidential fraction, Sluga Naroda, servants of the people, but I am not sure that these draft laws will be studied in the nearest future or in some specific period of time. So we're still under the situation when civil society has once more to highlight the fact that the time has passed long time ago when we had to feel ashamed of the collaboration subject. Yes, collaborationists, they exist in Ukraine. There is no doubt about it. But Ukrainian legislation, for the time being, does not have any laws about it. It shows that in the among the political elite, there are people that do not understand the consequences of Russian-Ukrainian war and do not understand that without resolving the issue of collaborationism, this will be not possible to create future only for the people that lost their relatives during the war, but for all Ukrainians in general. Thank you. Thank you. I would like to share my thoughts concerning your questions about why Ukraine, as you formulated, was not able to create the law that would defend the rights, human rights on the occupied territories. I would say this is black and white, too black and white. I would say that Ukraine managed to do certain things. It's not like black and white, and many things were not yet done. Maybe some social issues were not taken into account, and they are well seen and they are very painful today. But on every subject that we've been discussing, there are interesting positive achievements and also some gaps, and just the absence of work. And I see here three main reasons. The first reason is that legislation could regulate certain things, starting from constitution and by current laws as well. But the draft laws were discriminating people from occupied territories. And the brightest example, as colleagues shared, that the person that was prescribed at the occupied territory, when he goes to the bank, he is treated absolutely differently, and he faces the problems that do not exist at all for people that are registered on other territories, but not in the occupied territories. Another situation that I've witnessed myself working in the previous power, the issue of the political will, the political construction of the Parliament of Ukraine that was elected by the citizens. So there are political parties that could not find common language, and they were losing time and weeks under the situation when voting could not take place in a fast pace. But from another side, people were voting for that politicians themselves. And the third challenge is to be oriented on the current firefighting and long-term holistic understanding. And here brainstorming centers could be very useful. The dialogue should be created in order to work out long-term strategies. Thank you, Ostap. I would allow myself to add very briefly, and I'm sorry for having such a radical position. Professor Francis Fukuyama, when he conducted at his programs on Kiev platform, he was saying that when representatives of the public sector, it can be also executive branch as well as legislative, when they say that there is lacking of political will, it means that institutes do not have opportunity to implement or to take decision or to implement this decision if it has been already taken. And this is also reflected in the report, because when we analyze the question of capacities of implementation, this is one of the hardest problems, and we have to openly talk about it. There are objective factors. For example, the absence of the unified registers of property, of victims, of collaborators that complicate a solution of basic issues that are already regulated by the normative and legal acts. This and this is one of the recommendations that was mentioned practically at all the meetings, that we have to develop that unified register, national registers, to be able to understand the scale of this catastrophe. Number two, during discussions, experts and activists and representatives of public authorities that participated in our meetings, they highlighted the issues that we do not have owners of the processes. This is like they call it in the business. There is no any unified authority or body that is completely responsible for a specific issue. In order to resolve, for example, social issues with the prisoners, as Alexander Matvichuk was mentioning, just to resolve one question with the prisoners, you have to go through 5 institutions, because there are 5 different lists, and you have to agree all that upon and to mark it in all institutes in order to resolve this social issue with the prisoners. Why the owner of the process is absent? Because this is responsibility. So they replace this responsibility for complicated decisions. And so this replacement of responsibility from one structure to another, and also limits in the mandate of every one of the structures that actively is responsible for that, because complete responsibility means to be completely responsible for implementation of decisions. This is another question. This is another order of problems that was highlighted and presented in the report, and this is a separate subject that will require very serious work, capability of the structures to take decisions and to be able to implement that decisions into life. This is a separate, serious subject. I don't know if we can keep Ukraine form. We will stay here. We will be happy to answer all your questions. And our report is printed and it is also in access in electronic form. All the experts, all interested parties will receive electronic version, but I also would stimulate you to receive printed version, because this is a very instrumental to be used. And there is information about the project, about the report, can be found at the website of the Political Center of the Ukrainian Catholic University, and we will be happy to answer all your questions, and we will keep in touch. Thank you very much for coming, for being with us. We thank everyone who participated online. We thank our partners. We thank everyone, and see you again in the future. Thank you.